I can tell you.
This meeting is being recorded.
Which I can tell you, it's really good. It's really interesting. Makes for a really good read. So I really recommend it. And I would also like to thank all my colleagues at CONS and other programs at HI that are here today and have helped organize this event. HI and clinical trials have really like a long history. I mean, the organization has looked at clinical trials as a critical component in the access to medicines continuum, with some milestones like the meeting in Geneva back in 2015, all the work with the AMA regarding the transparency policy, and also the reforms that the European Union has been pushing forward in the last 3-4 years. HI has been involved in all of this. We've done this like with what we do normally, like producing quality evidence-based advocacy materials, engaging in open dialogue with all relevant stakeholders, and most of all, being an honest broker with all parties. Today, with this report, we have tried to do exactly that. I mean, to look at the issue of clinical trials, but under the light of the COVID-19 pandemic that has confirmed a pattern that was already present in the domain of like scientific research and like medical journalism, that it's like the importance of press releases, in the sense that we've seen how press releases were almost replacing clinical trials. The hype was replacing evidence. And then it's really when you see this sort of distortion of the facts that you see the importance of clinical trials and the need to protect the integrity of clinical trials, because it's not only about putting pressure to get like results reported, but also the protocols, the design of these clinical trials. So we've looked at in the first slide, it's very clear, and this report really abundantly explores this issue of what went wrong and what was done right in the conduction of clinical trials during COVID-19, especially as regards vaccines. But also what we really like to do is like to look ahead, look forward, and we are hopeful in the sense that there are some issues, some like signs that shows that governments and some regulatory authorities are taking seriously the issue of clinical trials. We have a resolution that is being currently discussed, and it's going to be hopefully tabled at the World Health Assembly. So really things are going in the right direction, but we still need to keep up the pressure. We still need governments to adequately fund clinical trials reporting mechanisms, and we really need like the work at the national level. That's something very clear, and that this report like shows. So with not much ado, I'm going to introduce Till. I mean, the issue here is like everybody knew Till. I mean, it's really when you say clinical trials, people like almost automatically think about TranspariMED, but I think it's good to know where Till comes from. He's the founder of TranspariMED, a campaign that works to end evidence distortion in medicine. Over the past 4 years, TranspariMED has successfully driven improvements in clinical trials reporting in Europe and the US through research and analysis, coalition building, political advocacy, and public pressure. And well, some of this work we have doing jointly with him. We have published like several joint TranspariMED reports, which we are very proud of that. And Till previously worked for the All Trials campaign, the anti-corruption group Transparency International, and international development organizations. Thank you, Till. You have the floor.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for joining today. So I'm going to talk about COVID clinical trials today, and I'm going to talk about what went well and what went wrong. And I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of things went really well with COVID trials and a lot of things went terribly wrong. And there's a lot of things that we can learn from that. And this is just going to be a brief talk, and it's based mainly on research done by academics, by outside groups, just trying to pull all the evidence together that's out there. So what went well and what went wrong? What can we learn from it? The structure is very straightforward. First, I'll talk about the COVID trial experiences for vaccines, for drugs, but also for social interventions. And then I'll talk about the implications for policymakers and regulators. So in terms of vaccine trials, I think there's general agreement that this was a great success overall. In March 2020, we wouldn't have expected that by the end of the year, we'd have reasonably safe, reasonably effective vaccines being produced. Access to the vaccines was a different issue. We're only talking about the medical research angle here. I've got to say the European Medicines Agency showed regulatory excellence throughout the process. In the beginning, they defined very clearly for pharma companies what sort of trial evidence they would accept, what the size of a trial would need to be. And then when the data came in, they reviewed the data very rapidly. And they were also very transparent about their decisions. EMA put into place extraordinary transparency measures. And that is something that in Europe we can be really proud of and really grateful for. But we've got to remember that the world is bigger than just Europe or Europe and North America. And there are a lot of new players on the medicine scene now. Around half of COVID vaccines taken worldwide are produced outside traditional medicine producing countries. And Transparency International wrote a brilliant report in which they pointed out that actually the transparency of COVID vaccine trials and of regulatory procedures in a lot of those countries was far weaker than in Europe. So that's really a global challenge going forward. If the pandemic isn't over anywhere until it's over everywhere, we've got to start thinking about what's happening with trials and with regulation in India, in China, in Brazil, in Russia, in Cuba, worldwide really. On drug trials, the picture was much more depressing, and I'm only going to talk here about trials of drugs that were already on the market. These were drugs that already existed that could rapidly have been used to help patients. And when the pandemic started, there was this huge drive to find out, are there any existing drugs that can help people to survive, that can help to get people out of hospital faster? And there was a huge amount of research waste because everyone scrambled to launch a clinical trial. There was very little coordination. In Spain alone, there were 20 separate clinical trials looking at the drug hydroxychloroquine. Worldwide, hundreds of trials looked at that one single drug, while other drugs went underexplored. A lot of the trials were too small, they were too badly designed to actually produce any useful evidence. Their outcome measures were inconsistent, so you can't even aggregate the data from multiple small trials to find out what works and what doesn't work. It was really a disaster. Part of the problem was that the International Trial Registry System, which is the only place in the world where you can see which clinical trials have been started, which are running, and where they're at, is pretty dysfunctional due to years of neglect and underfunding by policymakers. So a couple of weeks into the pandemic, the World Health Organization's registry system simply crashed and people couldn't access it anymore. The WHO enabled people to download the data set, which they updated on a weekly basis, but clearly this is not something that serves the public. And this was a systemic failure. So we can't point here at individual researchers and say, oh, you know, you designed this bad trial. We can't exclusively point at regulators saying, why didn't you do anything? Because the regulators will then point to government funders and say, well, why did they fund these trials? You know, and then the funders will point to ethics committees and they'll say, well, but the ethics committee approved the trial. So it's a systemic failure that we've seen. And Robert Califf, who's now the head of the FDA, already said in June 2020, the system is off course. This is not working. And then finally, we had trials of social measures. And you'll remember the mantra that governments were saying that we are following the scientific advice, we are following the scientific evidence. But as early as April 2020, Hilda Bastian pointed out in this brilliant article that actually the evidence on a lot of the measures that were being imposed was very weak, or it was contradictory, or it was lacking. So did we use the pandemic to create evidence on what works and what doesn't? And by and large, we didn't. There were very, very few randomized controlled trials of social interventions and social measures. So we still don't know what happened. The good news is that the few studies that there were generally did make their results public quite quickly. And in this space, we're in a regulatory vacuum because these kind of trials aren't overseen by medicines regulators. Researchers independently can't decide to just cluster randomized populations. This really needs political decision-making to happen. So what are the implications? So I'll be talking about the implications for regulators because there are some things that regulators are doing well, and there are some things that regulators could be doing a lot better in the future. But above all, we need to think about the implications for policymakers, because policymakers are really the key players here. They write the laws that regulators then enforce. We can't expect regulators to do things that they don't have the power to do, that they don't have the funding to do. So policymakers are really clear in here. So the first thing that we've learned from the pandemic trials, and especially from the drug trials, is we need better trials. And this is not new. I mean, back in 1994 already, Doug Altman, who's a bit of a patron saint of evidence-based medicine, he said, we need less research and better research. We need less clinical trials, but we need bigger and better designed clinical trials. And after more than a quarter of a century of discussion of this message has really gotten through to regulators now. So EMA experts published a scientific article recently saying that there is a need to support and enable large, well-designed trials. I think there's consensus among regulators on that now. And we're seeing action as well. I mean, we're seeing action on the policy level with the G7 Clinical Trials Charter, which was signed off by the health ministers of the G7 countries, saying exactly that. We need better, larger trials. We've got the ACT EU initiative launched by the European Commission and the European Medicines Agency to also work for that. But part of improving the research system is also stopping small bad trials from going forward, wasting money and taking away potential participants from large trials. And the question that's still unresolved is who's actually responsible from stopping these small trials from going ahead? Because regulators will probably say, we don't have the legal powers to do this. And they'll point at funders, and then the funders will point at ethics committees, and then we're back in the finger pointing circle again. The evidence on social measures. Well, what are we going to do when the next pandemic strikes? Are we going to take 168 million children out of school for a year, trusting that in every context this will do more harm than good? Or are we going to use future opportunities to generate evidence that tells us clearly, okay, in this context, it's appropriate to close schools. In this context, it's not appropriate to close schools. And for all these social measures, that evidence needs to be generated at some point. And what's really missing here is the policymakers. I'm not seeing any public discussion about the failures to generate evidence there. We had all the screaming in the media about face masks, about school closures, about are we following the science, aren't we following the science? Where is the political discussion now about how do we get the evidence so that next time we don't scream at each other, but we argue with each other based on the best evidence, and then we make the decisions that are actually best for people. And I think the responsibility there is very clearly with political leadership. This is not something that the research community can drive forward. And finally, we need transparency for all patients. You'll remember how in 2020, we were all waiting like, oh my God, when is that clinical trial result going to read out? When is that clinical trial finally going to finish? And results were made public super rapidly through preprints, in academic journals, on trial registries. But what about other patients? I mean, what about people who've got metastatic breast cancer? If no new treatments are developed, chances are in a few years' time, they're not going to be around anymore. They feel this urgency around clinical trials as well. But what we're seeing is around half of clinical trials still don't make their results public at all, ever. This is a recent study that found that over 2,000 clinical trials involving children have just become research waste because the results weren't made public. Then this is a study of German university trials where they found that within 24 months of completion, less than half had published their results. How is it acceptable to make patients wait for 24 months until a trial result is made public if we've learned during the pandemic that trial results can be made public within weeks? And then finally, the only way to really rapidly make trial results public is on trial registries. But if you look at trial registry data, it's often inconsistent because of this neglect of funding for trial registries and because of neglect partially also by regulators to enforce existing rules around trial registries. And I think going forward, we really need to have a discussion about ending this pandemic apartheid, where in a pandemic, when all of us are patients, suddenly everything is really urgent. And then afterwards, when it's only other people who are patients, we can wait 24 months, 36 months for clinical trial results. We need to fix the global trial registry network. And that requires not only technical fixes, but it also involves political engagement because a lot of them are run by national governments. We need to talk with the new global players like China, like Brazil, like India about, can we agree on some sort of minimum transparency standards that are acceptable to everyone? Can we have a sort of global minimum standards there? And in terms of responsibility, again, these are discussions that need to take place on the political level. So now the good news is that next month, the World Health Assembly will be gathering in Geneva, and the UK government has, together with Argentina, proposed a resolution that really contains all the essentials. It's a short resolution, but it talks about better trials, better trial coordination, more rapid results reporting, and more transparency. And the elegant thing about this resolution is that it's in very general terms, but it requests the Director General of the World Health Organization to, within 1 year, develop a global action plan for both pandemic and non-pandemic contexts. And I think if that resolution finds the support of WHO member states, it will really give everyone the forum and the space that's required at a policy level to discuss how to take this agenda forward. So if you want to learn more about clinical trial transparency, there's a guide for policymakers specifically published by Transparency International and Cochrane and TranspariMED. And if you want to learn more about research waste in COVID trials and also about the lack of trials for social interventions, I would recommend that you visit the website of COVID Evidence. They've published some absolutely fantastic studies. There are more good studies out there, but I think that's a single good entry point if you want to dig deeper into the literature. So thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thank you, Till. I think it was really good presentation. I think it covers not only like what it's in the report that you have already available link in the chat section of this call, but also the main issues. And I think that that is really like, I mean, you are really on point. I mean, saying at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of policymakers to take action, to push for the reforms that will later be coming into law. So I will now give the floor to Emma Thompson from Cochrane Collaboration. Emma Thompson, she's the Advocacy and Partnership Manager at Cochrane. She's an organization which focuses on producing relevant and timely synthesized evidence and is a global advocate for evidence-informed health and healthcare. Cochrane works towards a world of improved health where decisions about health and healthcare are informed by high-quality, relevant, and up-to-date synthesized research and evidence. Its members and supporters come from more than 150 countries worldwide. Emma, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Shalma, and great to be here and to follow on from Till's really good presentation, which gave quite a good overview of this issue. So as Shalma just mentioned, I work for Cochrane. For those of you who don't know, for the last 30 or so years, Cochrane has independently produced systematic reviews which synthesize and appraise the available evidence about different treatments and tests that are used in healthcare. And the large part of the data that we draw upon for those systematic reviews comes from clinical trials. So over the time that we've been doing this, as an organisation, we've developed quite an understanding of trial practices in terms of planning and conduct and reporting. And therefore, we've become an advocate for clinical trial transparency and for the conduct of trials which do not add to research waste and that make the best use of resources. A lot of our work over the years has uncovered concrete examples of things like publication bias, selective reporting, and so on. So we're really fully behind clinical trial transparency and the general principles that trials be registered in a publicly accessible, approved registry with a detailed protocol at the outset, that the results be then published there within 12 months, and then going to journal publication. We're also interested in the availability of CSR's clinical study reports. So those are the long, detailed documents that get submitted to medicines regulators and often are the most in-depth version of an account of a trial and give information that you just wouldn't find elsewhere, such as on severe adverse events and things like that. That's a little bit more controversial, but there are some bright kind of examples in that sphere. I think Till touched upon that with the EMA example, making those available, but actually implementation of access to clinical study reports in general is still quite patchy and there's a long way to go, still quite controversial. But the issue of, registering a trial in a registry and then publishing the summary results should not be controversial, right? Because that's been around for a long time. There are often laws and there's norms and, documents and guidelines where that's been around. But a work, from the report that Till just mentioned, the Transparency International report and many other documents that published and articles that keep coming out show that this doesn't actually happen in practice quite a lot of the time, and it's kind of unacceptable, really. So it's really great that people on this call are continuing to engage in advocacy because we need to get those numbers up. This is just not right that it carries on. So yeah, but then we are seeing some positive examples, I think, or some efforts at least of governments, academia, funding institutions to try and, address some of the common barriers. So I'm seeing a more positive picture emerging, but there is definitely much more that needs to be done in terms of implementation of those policies and actually backing that with, concerted effort to get things done. And I think it would be great to come back later to the the WHA resolution, because I think that could be a real opportunity here to get that moving. But to go back to the COVID experience, because that's, the topic of this call, at Cochrane, we've been doing reflection on the research response from our perspective and thinking about, well, what can we learn and what the recommendations should be. And it really echoes what was mentioned in Till's presentation about the sheer amount of waste, the huge amount of small, duplicative, poorly designed trials. So the need to really concentrate those efforts, or at least if you're doing smaller trials, using things like standardized protocols and adaptive trial designs so that the information then can be synthesized into a broader body of evidence. There's been a real lack of coordination, so we need more shared research agendas and prioritization. And then there's the basic clinical trial work. The Transparency International report showed that still wasn't happening even under emergency conditions where people are looking for this evidence and looking for that information coming out. So, with all that attention, you would think there would be a lot more effort to make sure that things are being done transparently, right? Because we're trying to get trust in the science or whatever it is. So, the registration of trials, sharing of them transparently and completely in registries, and then publications as soon as possible. And then the access to clinical study reports. I think you could also go further there and talk about individual participant data. Again, that's another controversial issue, but it's one that's come up quite a lot during the pandemic, and there is value in having access to that, but it's been quite difficult to get. And then there's also the point about reflecting on the imbalance in terms of where trials are being conducted. So, we need, and I see this in that resolution draft for the World Health Assembly about, building those capacity and, enabling trials to be conducted in a variety of contexts, and making sure that, those global trials that have multi-country involve adequate input from those different countries, particularly from the global south. And then there's the issue of making sure that there's a registration of those national components is done correctly, because that's also caused some issues with data fragmentation at the analysis stage. But overall, I think we're at a good juncture to be thinking about shaping the agenda of clinical trials and trial transparency, as the title of this session is. And I think especially in light of this WHO resolution discussions. So I'd like to pass back now to Jaume, and let's all talk about this.
Thank you, Emma, for your response. I think that it highlights also the importance. I think what you were saying at the end of your intervention. I mean, what about those clinical trials that are being held outside the European Union? What about these patients that are participating in these clinical trials? What happens with them afterwards? And I think I also share this sense, if not optimism, at least like of renewed hope. I mean, with this resolution that at least is placing the issue in the agenda and gives us the opportunity to engage in these kind of conversations. And now I would open the floor for all participants, and I would ask, like, raise your hands and introduce yourselves and ask your question or share your comment. Thank you. Okay, I don't see any. Okay. Rita, and then MOGA. Rita, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Sharma. I work for Prescrire, a drug bulletin, an independent drug bulletin based in Paris. I wanted to thank Till for this brilliant presentation, and also that he raised the positive aspects we experienced, because most often we only point out the negative side of a medal. So thank you for also having pointed out what went well. And I wanted to only make a small comment on the drug development, so not on vaccines. What I saw from literature, the most evidence we got on drugs for COVID came from the UK clinical trials, the recovery trial. And now the Oxford leader who worked on this trial, he set up a new entity to use this model also for other diseases. And what he says is really, he focuses, we need simple trials. Of course, we need large trials, but the trials should not be too complex. And I think this is a really interesting idea, and I hope he will have success for other diseases to use such trials. I'm wondering if you haven't considered what was done in the recovery trial and if we can use it also for other diseases, for example. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. I don't know if Till, you want to take this one?
I think I'll leave that to Emma because she's really the evidence synthesis specialist here.
Okay, Emma, you are on the spot now.
Okay, no problem. I think that's a really interesting question. Thank you, Rita. And I think in the conversations that we've been having, kind of in analysing what's been going on with the research response to COVID, the recovery trial is really often presented as kind of a bright spot and something that seemed to work very well. And I think I'm not a trialist myself, but there seems to be a lot of optimism about the potential for this type of trial design to work for other disease areas. So yeah, why not?
Thank you, Emma. And I'm going to give the floor now to MOGA. MOGA, you have the floor, and Nicolas, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you for really interesting and very, very useful presentations. I'm sorry I wasn't here from the beginning. So I just got a couple of questions. So it's particularly for Emma. I mean, I remember the days when at the beginning of the Cochrane collaboration and Ian Chalmers, and one of the problems that you were facing is the fact that pharmaceutical companies do not, the bias in trials in the sense that they don't publish negative results or even neutral results. And I'm just wondering, how far have you gone in getting more of the negative neutral results being published on treatment and other interventions? And how do you see the proposed resolution as WHO? How much would it help with this one, with kind of forcing, I don't know, is the wrong word, I guess, but really forcing, become a standard that you have to publish whatever the result is. And for Tim, again, how do you see the resolution answering questions about transparency and about setting standards, so we don't repeat goodness knows how many trials were on remdesivir, and because they're small trials, we're just lost when, yeah, it's wonderful, no, it's not. And now it's, well, it could work in some places. So my last question to anyone who will take it is, how do we get, or how to basically engage with developing countries who run clinical trials in their country, whether their own clinical trial or from companies that run the trials in their countries? How do you get them engaged in these issues so that they are part of setting the standards and then implementing the standards? Thank you.
Okay, so Till and Emma for the first 2-3 questions, and then it's like an open question for all of us in the last one, which I find it interesting. Till?
Yeah, I just wanted to go to the question of research waste and unreported clinical trials. I mean, what we've seen in the European Union is that national regulators in some member states have started taking this quite seriously. For example, BfArM in Germany, the Austrian regulator, they've been in touch with trial sponsors. They've reminded them to upload missing results. They've reminded them what the rules are and said, please, your trial results are overdue. You need to upload these trial results now. With other regulators, notably in Spain, in France, in Italy, we've been begging them for about 2 years now to simply send out email reminders that say you're breaking the rules, your clinical trial result is overdue. The European Medicines Agency has given them a list of all trials in their country that are overdue in violation of the rule, and these regulators are still not doing it. There is nothing that EMA can do about this. As far as I know, EMA have been very pro-transparency. They've been very helpful in this process. But as long as we have that level of regulatory neglect, we can't really expect clinical trialists to do any better. You know, if somebody says there's a rule, but then nobody even sends you a reminder email, how can you expect people to follow that rule? And in many situations, there are ways in which compliance could be improved so much simply through better communication, through small things like that. And we're not seeing that. And I think that is a real tragedy. You know, we could have thousands of clinical trial results rescued from becoming research waste if only some emails were being sent, if only registries sent reminder emails. And there's some very low-hanging fruit out there that still hasn't been picked.
Yeah, and just to follow up for that from the Cochrane perspective, as that's kind of how you led into the question, MOGA. Yeah, this is still a huge issue for us. You know, we can only use what's available, and we have, you know, quite sophisticated ways of searching for information, but there's limits to that as well. So I think this is why we need to keep continuing to push on this. It's quite interesting as well, though, in many contexts, because your question was about pharmaceutical companies, but often we're finding that it's the academic institutions that tend to be weaker, often because pharmaceutical companies in theory have an incentive to hide results that they don't see desirable, but also they have huge amounts of budgets and compliance procedures that don't necessarily exist in all academic institutions. So it's still a kind of an across-the-board issue. I think we're seeing some improvements, but it's, you know, much more to keep going with.
Jaume, you're on mute.
2 years have passed and I still have to mute myself. Sorry. I was saying that I'm going to respond to the question regarding the resolution and what to do with developing countries, because I think that they are linked. In the sense, in the resolution, the issue of transparency is addressed, at least like the drafts that we've seen, and we know that it's part of the discussion, but at the same time, like the idea that clinical trial results have to be reported and all results, I think that what Tir was saying, that like a lot of work has been done in the last like 5 years now. It's really like an accepted truth. I mean, it's really like a principle, and I think that that's going to be in the resolution. And what I think, like for developing countries really to be involved in like setting the standards and enforcing the standards, we need them to be at the table in such instances as the World Health Assembly and this resolution. That's why we think that it's good that like the co-chairs of this discussion of the draft resolution together with the United Kingdom is Argentina. We think that it's good to have a low and middle income country there pushing, because the issue here, it's like an issue of agency, in the sense like the idea that people participating in a clinical trial in a developing country will have less rights or less guarantees that someone participating in a clinical trial in the European Union or the US is unacceptable. And I think that's something that we are seeing now, in the sense we see, for example, people that participated in some of the clinical trials for vaccines that they didn't get any kind of like access to second doses or access to the vaccine if they had been given like the one that it's not the active ingredient. So I think it's also one of these issues where like ethics and like medical science like sort of collide in a very clear way. So I think that especially when it comes to multi-center clinical trials, when there's like Western, like normally it's an academic institution that works in collaboration with other organizations in the global South. Here is where we need to push, in the sense to make sure that the same rights that are granted for the participants in Europe are also granted and fulfilled in other countries in the global south. I don't know if there are any other reactions to any of these topics. Okay, now I'm going to give the floor to Nicolas. Nicolas, if you could introduce yourself, like the work you do.
Yeah, sure. So that's what I was going to talk. Till had asked me to mention some of the work I do. So I run the trials tracker project at the University of Oxford, at formerly the Data Lab, now the Bennett Institute for Applied Data Science. We just changed our name, but that's under Ben Goldacre. And so some of you may be familiar with the EU and FD AAA trials trackers, which manage track compliance with the reporting requirements in the US and the EU. But directly relevant to COVID research, I've been working with colleagues in Berlin at the Charité on COVID reporting as part of the DIRECT project. And we had some preliminary results in BMJ Open in the fall. I think that came out about, sort of saying that looks like things, as Till said, things were getting reported more rapidly, but still maybe not as quick as one might hope in a public health emergency. But the bigger finding from that research was the all the stuff that goes into allowing you to be able to do that research is lacking at a systemic level. And this is some of what Till was touching on in his talk. I just finished writing a thesis that I couldn't have hammered at this point home more than enough, in that the global registry system is sort of this incredible resource, that it even exists and that we have it, and that, but if it's just, if it's just a thing that becomes a bureaucratic check mark that you need to do to get your trial published somewhere eventually, and no one is actually using it or checking it or ensuring that the data on it is accurate, we can't make full use and full effect of it for transparency and accountability. And the COVID pandemic really shined a big light. It was a problem everywhere, but it shined a big light on it. I don't want to see registries are the only thing anyone should matter about. It happens to be what I research, so I think a lot about them. But it's indicative of this larger neglect, like Till was just talking about, with regulators and attention. And I had a paper come out that wasn't just focused on COVID, but just showing how regulators throughout the EU were just not just ignoring reporting, but ignoring sort of basic, essentially paperwork handling in regards to making information public about trials covered in the EU, conducted in the EU. That is sort of a regulatory responsibility of being part of the EU system. So, which limits, the utility of something like an EU CTR. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight, what the sort of research tells us, and we'll have more, much more long-term follow-up results about COVID results that we'll be sharing preliminary results of at the World Conference on Research Integrity later next month. But that can help inform and underlie things like what's going on at the World Health Assembly, and how the WHO would consider, if that is enacted and that language is enacted, how they might consider what that might look like for what's reasonable to expect people to report, where should they report. Our preliminary results showed that almost no one was using registries to rapidly disseminate trial results, even if preprints were emerging as a major route. So, and there's pros and cons to all of those. So yeah, I just wanted to give a perspective from my point of view as someone who's considering and always looking at this stuff very closely as a researcher who works directly on these sorts of topics. So yeah, I mean, if anyone has any, there was no question there really. I just wanted to give a bit of perspective and thought that, but if anyone has questions that for me or whatever, that's fine too, or wants to expand on anything.
Yeah, thank you, Nicolas. I think it's really interesting, in the sense, especially like this issue of how different EU regulators are behaving, in a sense. Why is it that the Germans are doing in such an efficient way, and Italians and French seem to choose not to. I mean, because that's the issue. I think at the end, it's a matter of choice. So I think it's also like interesting, like you mentioned, like the issue of like academic publishing. In the sense, there's also an issue, like some people believe that if they like report or record the results before publication, it loses some of its interest, or like maybe journals are not going to be that interested, and that's false. That's like one of these urban legends, like in the sense that they say if you publish, you will not be able to patent. So that's interesting in the sense that there are all these tropes and things which are not true, that with this pandemic have gone really on steroids, I mean, and have affected like very seriously like the conduction of clinical trials. Rita, you have the floor.
Yes, maybe I don't know if it's an answer, but I think one aspect maybe which is not so, we have less light on, is the human resources in the agencies for departments who have to deal with transparency questions, etc. At least with the EMA, what we experienced now the last years is, of course, for the pandemic, EMA set in place special rules to publish data, information, clinical study reports, because it was an emergency. But for the normal business, since 2018, nothing is going on transparency. They stopped to making documents available. And people who ask questions for documents, they are put in a queuing system. And we at Prescria, we are waiting now to get a 10-page document, which are normally no difficult documents. So the EMA has the documents. There is nothing confidential in. So for a 10-page, we have to queue for 1 year before the EMA is now opening such requests. Simply, I think it's because EMA doesn't have the human resources to deal with the questions. For example, I see at the French agency, they get more and more tasks to deal with, but with the same budget, so with the same number of people, staff. And so I think these organizations for transparency topics, they are simply understaffed. And here we have to claim for more budget and more human resources.
I think with the EMAs, it's very clear, like the idea, or the fact that they are understaffed. I mean, especially we have had like an extension of mandate for the EMA due to COVID, but no new staff. They still have they have left like a quarter of their people back in London. So it's really, Phil, you have the floor.
Yeah, just on the issue of underfunding and understaffing, as far as I know, and I might be incorrect, the global clinical trial registry hub that's run by the World Health Organization is run by one person part-time in the WHO. So the global clinical trial registry infrastructure hinges on one person part-time, and I think that is indicative of what we're seeing. The Indian clinical trial registry doesn't even have an IT support person on staff. They just have IT support coming around once a year. The Dutch trial registry looks like it was built by a teenager on his holiday. The German trial registry is an embarrassment. There is just such severe underfunding in this area. And according to one estimate, every year we're wasting $170 billion in health research to research waste. And it is just so much cheaper to fix the infrastructure around these things than to run even more useless clinical trials, to have all this data getting lost because of neglect. I think
You
there's a
mean the new-
very, very strong economic argument for investment in this area.
I was going to add to that, even the new EU registry, the CTIS that we waited 8 years for and through numerous delays, it's in my opinion, as someone who looks at registries all the time, entirely unimpressive in its current form, right? And you have the model, right? Clinicaltrials.gov. It's not perfect, but it is, I think it's pretty excellent as an information system generally, in its functionality and its design. And they had the model right there and what they should have, aimed to copy and sort of work with, and they apparently chose not to do that. And I don't know what they spent so much time doing if this is what came out the other end.
Thank you, Till, and thank you, Nicolas, for this. I mean, that's really interesting, because at the same time we have reasons to be optimistic with this project of a resolution and this the idea already, the public opinion that we need to take clinical trials seriously. But at the same time, we have this, in the sense that, again, it's a choice. It's a choice not to spend money on infrastructures. I mean, even if it's human or technical, I think that's something that needs to be addressed, but it needs to be addressed at the political level. That it's the policymakers that have to listen to the academics, that have to care about what the researchers are really, since they're enduring these difficulties. And I think it's also very, very, okay, you see, okay, Kristen, what she's saying, in the sense the dependence of some most of regulatory agencies from the industry. We need public money into regulatory authorities. I mean, to make them really and truly independent and autonomous. And for the EMA, I think it's really interesting. Okay, what Rita is saying, that since 2018, things have going very have slowed down in terms of transparency and access to documents, but also we have to give credit to them. My former colleague, Ansala Santos, she was very active when she was at HIGH, pushing for transparency at the EMA together with Till. And some things were accomplished in the sense, even if it was only recognizing that there was a problem. And then you see that they started taking action on that, and now it has stopped. At the same time, you see the pharmaceutical industry in the US, they are now discussing the new USTR report, and they are accusing EMA of I don't know, some sort of divulgating trade secrets, because they are pushing for access to clinical study reports. So I think it's interesting to see the position EMA finds itself sometimes. And I think it's clear that there's this need for political support and also funding. MOGA, you have the last word, literally.
I didn't mean the last one. Anyway, don't we have an example of the US? Remind me again, if the US government fund a trial like the NIH or something, fund a trial, don't they have a conditionality that the company or the research institutions have to publish whatever the result? Is that not?
Yes. So that is technically the policy of the NIH, but they are not particularly interested in. It's the policy to do that, and if you don't do it, you could have future funds withheld. But they don't. My understanding, talking to people on the ground, colleagues in the U.S., is that NIH is sort of refusing to act and put any teeth into that policy. They are waiting for FDA to act first on anyone, and FDA is not acting, at least not in any systemic or organized fashion. There's a little bit of haphazard enforcement activity going on very recently, but yeah. So there is a policy, but it's not quite that simple of the policy fixes the problem.
Thank you. Till, for the floor.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing some medical research funders in the UK get very serious about this. Wellcome Trust, National Institute of Health Research, Medical Research Council, they now monitor whether their grantees make their clinical trial results public. A lot of other funders, including Horizon Europe, do not do this. And with the NIH in the US, you can check the TranspariMED blog. I just put up another piece today. There are universities out there that have been breaking the rules for years. They've been called out on it multiple times, and they still continue to receive funding for new clinical trials. And that is simply not a responsible stewardship of public money. It's a complete waste of money. And I mean, if you just put a fraction of that money into actually improving regulatory oversight, you know, the benefit for medical research and for patients would be huge. But so far outside the UK, we're only seeing that very rarely. Some funders in Europe now are also starting on this. We got a study coming out on that, hopefully within the next couple of months.
I think that was a good summary of the situation as well. So we've come to the end of this roundtable, and I would like to thank very especially Till for his participation, and especially for this report, Emma also for this brilliant response and sharing her insights at Cochrane, and also my colleagues Alex, Luciana, Jessica, and my boss, who is also participating. And well, thank you all. We will be distributing and disseminating the recording of this conversation, and we will be introducing some of the comments that we have taken notes of into the report to make it better. And well, hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Very useful. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.